We love this, so this is our I can statements. Okay, we're going to start with this idea of a social contract and a conversation about a state. And this might be new for you. This is an important social studies conversation we're about to have. So before we begin, I'd like to get a feel for what you know or think about when you hear the term social contract. You may have come across this in a world history or a U.S. history or a civics course, but definitely we're going to be using this in CWI. So I'm going to put on the chat box, and for those of you that are familiar with social contract, I'd like you to write down in the chat box what you think social contract is, or anything related to it, so that I can get an idea. Give them a good guess. Like the Constitution, I love that. You are right in that there's a connection between social contract and the Constitution, especially in the United States. Madison, that's great that you don't know because you're about to learn. That's awesome. Other thoughts about social contract? You're thinking, you know what, I'm still not sure. You guys, I just learned what IDK means. Remember I told you guys I have to look this stuff up on the internet? Like TMI, I didn't know what that was. I had to look it up. I do now know I don't know. Okay, Alicia, good guess. What do we do daily? Is that what social contract is? A way of living. Good guesses, you guys. We're getting closer with the idea of contract, and Jessica put in there maybe freedom of speech, things that are acceptable behavior. Good guesses. You guys, this is awesome. I'm going to give you guys a smiling face for going for this. Okay, let me scroll up. All right, Marshall. A social contract is either unwritten or written contract between a government and its people, or the people and themselves, that defines how we interact with each other. Good job, Marshall. That's awesome. And that's what we're looking at. And you guys, when we go over social contract, I don't want you to be all worried that you might not know what it is right now, because in about 7 minutes, you're going to be well immersed in the conversation about social contract. But in order to get there, we have to talk about this word called a state. Now, this is sometimes confusing for social studies students, so I'm going to explain it, and then we're going to practice it. Okay, so our question is, what's the connection between social contract and a state? Well, you first of all have to start with state to get to social contract. So that's how we're going to sequence this. So there's 4 defining aspects of what a state is. And you've already read some of this in your CWI class. There's 4 things. Number 1, in order to be a state, a big S, you have to have a defined territory. So you have to have a defined territory. Let me start with this question. We're going to do this as a polling response. We're going to do a yes or no. So above you, you're going to see the check mark come. I want you to give me a green check mark if you think that Washington State has a defined territory. Do we have a defined territory in Washington? Ooh, I love this. Lots of green checks. That's awesome. You're right. We do. We do have a defined territory. Let me put the chat box on, and I'm going to ask you guys a couple questions, and let's see if we can define this territory in Washington. What borders Washington to the north? Geographically, what borders us to the north? Canada. Awesome. What borders us to the south? What borders Washington? Oregon. Nice job. What borders us to the west? Oh, almost, Emily. To the west. To the west. Everybody to the west. There you go. Pacific Ocean. There you go, Emily. Pacific Ocean. Now, what borders us to the east? I know. You guys knew what was coming. You predicted my next question. I love that. Good job, you guys. All right, let me grab those chats. Let me give you a smiling face geography lesson. So we do have a territory. But you guys, I'm going to tell you, we are not a state. Not as defined in social studies. We are not a state as defined by this conversation. Okay, number 2, we have to have a population. So give me a green check mark if Washington has a population. Do we have people that live here? Oh, there we go. Now we have even more green checks. We're like, yeah. Let me turn on the chat box. What are we called? The people that live in Washington, what are we called? a population. What are we called? Citizens is a great guess. Washingtonians is correct. We are Washingtonians. That's right. So we have a defined territory, guys. We have a population. But guess what? We are still not a state. We are still not a state. Now here's the third thing to be a state. You have to have an organized system of government with the power to make and enforce laws. All right, give me a green check. Does Washington State have the authority to make and enforce laws? Do we have a system of government? Look, there's like 36, 37, 40-ish. There we go. And you're right, we do. I'm going to open up the chat box, and I love, Kai already put in here, RCWs, you write Revised Codes of Washington. We do have laws. Where is our seat of government in Washington State? In other words, where is our capital where our government is really working? Olympia is correct. You guys, exactly. Does anybody know who our governor is in Washington? Who is it that heads our state, Washington State? No guesses. Oh, I bet you'll recognize it. There you go, Grace. Nice job. You got it, Grace. You got it, Jared. Jay Inslee is our governor. He heads our state of Washington. We have a legislature. We have a court system. We have government structures even at the city locales. So we definitely have a state. So Cameron's like, well, then why aren't we a state? That's a great question. So let me grab your chest off. Let me tell you this. We have a territory in Washington. We have a population in Washington. We have an organized government, but we are not a state as defined by our global standard of what a state is. A state is a big S. And here's why. It's this one. It's the crowning one. It's the very last. It's this idea of sovereignty. Now, in order to understand why we're not a state, you have to understand what sovereignty means. So let's go back to our Common Core. Remember, we have to determine the meaning of words. This word is vital. In order to understand that Washington is not a state, you have to understand sovereignty. So let me put on the chat box. Any ideas of what sovereignty means? You're like, nope, this is a new word for me. Exactly. That's why we have to understand the word in order to get the meaning. That's exactly right, you guys. I appreciate that. Okay, somebody put it up there. I just saw it fly through. Kai is right. It's supreme power. That's exactly right, Kai. When you have sovereignty as a state, you have absolute power in your territory, over your people, and within your government, which means that there's no higher power than you. So Washington cannot be a state as defined in our CWI class. It cannot be a state as defined by global standards. Now the question is why? Who has supreme power and authority over the United States? Over Washington State. Thing is, sometimes I give you guys the answer when I ask the question. It's not the people. Colin is right. It's the federal government, Colin. Aaron is right. There you go, Bridget. Washington cannot be a state as defined on this slide, guys, because we don't have sovereignty. And I'm going to grab your chats. Let me give you some examples. Washington State cannot declare war. Washington State cannot print its own money. Washington State cannot enter into a binding treaty with another nation. So thinking about the idea of Washington, we are a state within a state. So what's our state? What's our state? Today, a state is a country, is a nation. They're all